Hello, everyone, and welcome to Radio Socialist Olympia, the podcast of the Olympia Democratic Socialists of America. I'm Isaac Wagnitz. My regular co-host Corey Miller wasn't able to join us this time, but will be back for future installments. For folks who maybe aren't regular listeners, our last few episodes have been part of a political education series highlighting the histories of and differences between the political traditions of liberalism and socialism. Today, though, we're taking a bit of a break from theory to talk about a current working class struggle that's going on here in our communities, that of grocery retail employees. We're joined today by Michael Hines, president of the United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, Local 367 based in Tacoma. UFCW 367 represents about 8,000 retail workers in Pierce, Thurston, Mason, Lewis, and Grays Harbor counties. Mostly grocery employees at Safeway, Albertsons, Fred Meyer, and QFC stores, but also some smaller independent grocery stores such as the Ralph's and Baby Thriftway here in Olympia, Swanson's in Aberdeen, SARS in Pierce County, among others. In the interest of full disclosure, I am also a shop steward and executive board member with UFCW 367. And as usual, of course, the opinions expressed here are those of the people giving them, not necessarily the official stances of either Olympia DSA or, in this case, UFCW 367. That said, 367 was recently in contract bargaining with Safeway, Albertsons, and Kroger, that's Fred Meyer and QFC, stores here in the region, represented locally by the Business Association Allied Employers. The local has reached a tentative agreement with the employers, which has since been ratified by a vote of the membership. For context of this episode, the last few years of the COVID-19 pandemic have been particularly difficult for retail workers generally, who have, by the nature of their jobs, been unable to work from home and have often faced increased customer volumes due to restaurant closures and other reasons. This greater workload has frequently been combined with employers' disregard for working conditions and safety concerns, not to mention a steadily increasing cost of living. At the same time, grocery chains have reaped massive profits, engaged in major stock buybacks, and paid executives huge bonuses. A recent study by the Economic Roundtable describes the difficulties faced by grocery workers during the pandemic, and data gathered by the UFCW International shows just how great a windfall big grocery chains have experienced. But the hardships and heightened inequality of the pandemic have also helped increase labor militancy and class consciousness among workers, including service and grocery employees. If you're listening to this podcast, you've probably also heard about the ongoing wave of union organizing at Starbucks shops around the country, including here in Olympia, as well as recent strikes by BCTGM against Nabisco and Kellogg's, and UAW against John Deere, among others. And in the course of their respective contract bargaining with Kroger, UFCW Locals 7 in Denver, Colorado, and 555 in Portland, Oregon recently struck over unfair labor practices, winning some of their demands from the company. So with all that in mind, let's welcome Michael Hines to the program.
Good afternoon, Isaac. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for what we're about to talk about.
Glad to have you here with us. First off, tell us a bit about yourself. How did you first get involved in the labor movement, and what was your path to eventually becoming president of UFCW 367?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So my first union job was at the Herbst Hardware in the Highland Hill neighborhood of Tacoma. And this would have been back in 1985. I was fresh out of high school. And it just so happens that UFCW Local 367 represented that store. So everything has sort of come full circle now that I'm here as the president. A couple years after that, I went to work for the Pay and Save Distribution Center. They also happened to be represented by UFCW, a different local. And I wasn't too engaged in the union back then. I remember going to pay my dues at the office. I remember the shop steward being really into safety, but I wasn't too involved. Becoming more involved really didn't happen until probably the mid-90s when I worked at Allamore Hospital. I was running the linen distribution department there. We were non-union, and we'd seen our wages frozen for about 3 years. Our sister hospital, Tacoma General, continued to see wage increases, and we knew that they were represented by UFCW. So one day I reached out to the union organizer at Local 1001, that's UFCW. We started having meetings at my house. We won an election for representation, and that ultimately led into a career as an organizer for me. And then shortly after that, I moved to Spokane, took a job there at UFCW Local 1439, organized grocery workers and meat cutters for about a year before moving back to the Tacoma, Seattle area. And then I ended up working at UFCW 1001. I went to work for the International for about 5 years. One of the campaigns that I was assigned to during that time was the Smithfield Packing House campaign in North Carolina. And then I moved back to this area and went to work for 21, where I was a grievance representative and a negotiator. So for the past 23 years, I've worked as an organizer, a field representative, an international representative, which pretty much did all sorts of different tasks, and then negotiator and a grievance representative. And it was because of this background in all these different areas that I was offered a job as executive assistant to the president at Local 367 in Tacoma. That was in October of 19, right before the pandemic hit. And then because of circumstances that I really couldn't foresee, both the officers, the president and the secretary treasurer at the time, ended up stepping down from their positions. And I was sworn into office as president last July. So that's kind of my background, and I'm excited about the direction that we're heading with this union.
So going back to very basic stuff for a minute, we're assuming that all of our listeners really are supporters of organized labor. But for those who maybe haven't been in a union before, can you give us a sort of overview of how unions work? Like what goes into organizing a bargaining unit and negotiating a contract, stuff like that.
Yeah, we like to use a model. If you could picture a circle or a pie with four equally divided parts, and then picture sort of an arrow going around the outside of the circle, moving in one direction. That's the model that we use to describe the four ways that a union builds power. We teach it in our leader in action training. And the first piece of the pie would always start with organizing, and not just any organizing, but organizing within our core industries. So grocery, meat packing, food processing, non-food retail, these are the core industries of UFCW. And then you also have internal, external organizing. Internal would be, you want to ensure that you're wall-to-wall, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about that later on in the program. But you want to be organized, have everybody union from wall-to-wall in a facility, and then you have external organizing, which is going out and meeting with, say, a food processing plant, somewhere in Tacoma with no experiences, being union and going in as an organizer and meeting with them and walking them through the process of how to form a union in their workplace. Once you kind of move on from that piece of the pie, you move on to the next piece, which is, it's not enough to organize. We have to negotiate good contracts. You mentioned Starbucks, and then, of course, we've seen Amazon, what's happening with Amazon around the country. I'm excited about the recent wins in the organizing attempts. And I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but they're not truly organized until they have a first contract in place that provides for just cause and other union standards. And I do believe that they're going to get those in their first contract, but we just have to wait and see how that plays out. And then the third part of the pie would be, once we have a contract, we need to go train and educate members in the workplace so that they can enforce their contract and hold the employer accountable. And Isaac, you're one of those individuals that is a shop steward and activist in the workplace, and your job is to know the contract and make sure that the employers are following it. And one of the things that I'm the most proud about with our local compared to other locals is that I have a pretty extensive background in grievances and arbitrations, and so does my executive assistant. So you have two types of grievances. You have discipline cases that fall under just cause, and then you have contractual violations. The contractual violations are an organizing opportunity. We can, if there's an issue happening out there in the workplace, violation of scheduling procedures or safety standards or different things that end up being violations of the contract, we can file a grievance on behalf of everyone in the store and organize around that issue and get people activated to come to meetings and to take on the boss. So we get really excited talking about those things. And then the final piece of the pie would be really taking our voice out to the community in the political arena. This is so that we can change laws that are more labor friendly. And as you can imagine, this model that I just shared with you, one feeds upon the next. So, the better laws you have in place, the easier it is to go organize, and the more willing people are to organize, and then the better contracts you get. And it just keeps kind of cycling through. The four areas feed on one another, and if we're doing our work at the highest level, we can truly show collective power as a union.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to have that for the audience because, I grew up in a family that had union folks going back a few generations, but before I worked in the grocery store, I hadn't been in a union, and as much as I liked unions, I didn't actually really know that much about how they worked in the day-to-day.
Yeah.
And yeah, the thing about organizing a union is that it's a long road too, which was something I didn't realize at the time. It's there's a lot of struggle and organizing that goes into that.
There is. It's great to go through that process. When I went through it at Allamore Hospital, it was pretty eye-opening, and you start to see, I was one of those that was probably treated more favorably at Allamore, so I surprised upper management when I was heavily involved in the organizing campaign. But I saw my coworkers not being treated the same as I was. Mm-hmm. And, but just seeing everybody come together, I feel sorry for anyone who hasn't been through an organizing campaign because it's so eye-opening, and it just allows people to really feel what solidarity is all about.
The power to collectively change your own situation.
Yeah.
On that kind of note, since you've been president of the local, you've talked a lot about building a member-driven union. Can you talk about what that means in practice and how that maybe contrasts with other approaches or models that unions can take? And why is this the correct path for organized labor?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. So when I was sworn into office back in July, one of the things that I shared with the executive board was a 3-point vision to move the local forward. There were a number of areas that I saw needed attention, and one of those was to build a member-driven union, and then with that came being fiscally responsible and operating in the spirit of transparency. And I feel like our activists, shop stewards, and leaders out there really support that vision. The way to look at member-driven, I think it's similar to the rank-and-file strategy that DSA follows. We understand that real power comes from bottom-up organizing. It's about creating a grassroots movement. We saw what this can look like during the presidential runs of Obama and Sanders. On top of that, this is the way unions built a critical mass back in the 30s and 40s before hitting, their highest density at 35% in 1954. It was through organizing and educating the base. Organizations committed to both of these concepts and creating a membership that can win on the shop floor. So the opposite approach to that, I guess, would be that there's a number of unions out there that they're more structured like a corporate hierarchy. They're very top down versus bottom up, like we're trying to build. And they might win in the short term with that approach, especially when it comes to politics, if they're large, but they're not really building sustainable power in the long term. I always tell our members that it's not what I say and do at the bargaining table that makes a difference. It's what the members do out in the stores. That's what the employers are afraid of. So our job as a union, I think our ultimate goal is to organize and educate our members so that they can win in the workplace, give them all the tools and resources they need. They are the union, not us. We're the union hall that offers all of these resources to the members.
No matter how good your leadership is and no matter how much they really want to fight the employer for a better deal, if the rank and file isn't agitated to win it, it's not going to happen. You're just going to be blowing smoke otherwise. So having that rank and file militancy is really important.
Yeah, we still run into the situations, where people they're asking us, what are you doing for us? How come you can't do this or can't do that? Why do I pay dues? And what they do is they third party the union, right?
Yes.
And that's just not how it works.
No union is perfect, but part of your job as a member is if there's something that's not good about it is to help make it better.
Yep, exactly.
So moving on to grocery retail specifically and the impacts of the pandemic on frontline workers. At our locals leadership conference back in January, there was an interesting presentation by John Marshall, who's an economist from the UFCW International. And he was talking about economic trends in the grocery industry during the pandemic years. As a Marxist, I love political economy and I have to bring it into everything. Among the key takeaways from that study, though, were grocery chains basically doubled their yearly profits over pre-pandemic times, again, due to that consumer shift away from restaurants and so on. There were a lot of stock buybacks worth a lot of money and big executive bonuses, which vastly overshadowed relatively meager expenditures on hazard pay for workers, and worker pay actually shrinking as a percentage of these companies' revenue. Hopefully this helps put 367 and other UFCW locals contract bargaining into context, and I will put the slideshow that Marshall did into the show notes or link to it. Some questions about all that. First off, what are stock buybacks and what's their purpose? How do they kind of fit into how the big grocery chains behaved during the pandemic?
Well, I think a simple way to describe stock buybacks is it's when a company uses their cash on hand to repurchase stock shares that are out in the open market. And what this does is it drives up the price of the shares, and ultimately it's for the benefit of the shareholder, right? So these companies made record profits. Kroger, Safeway, Albertsons, they all made record profits during the pandemic, but instead of putting the money back into the pockets of the employees or making the stores safer, they chose to engage in actions that benefited their investors first. They did pay out some hazard pay for a short duration of time, and they negotiated with us over safety precautions and all that, but it was pretty minimal, really, what they did. Mm-hmm. Pretty disgraceful, really.
In the next question, I was going to bring up some of the grocery chain, when media attention was briefly focused on essential workers, some grocery chains did implement hazard pay for maybe like a couple weeks or a month, but then they quickly withdrew it when the media spotlight shifted. So unions and labor activists then shifted to trying to get cities and counties to implement local hazard pay mandates. And this had some mixed success, it seems like. Seattle and Olympia enacted hourly hazard pay increases, but it was unsuccessful in other places like Tumwater and Lacey here in our area. But both the grocery chains and some local elected officials had some rather interesting justifications for not giving workers continued hazard pay. What were some of those that you heard? And do you think this was kind of a moment for realizing who the actual pro-labor politicians are versus those who claim to be?
Yeah, well, there's no question that Seattle and Berrien and some of these areas up north of us are much more liberal as far as politics and city councils go. We were fortunate in Olympia to have a really good city council there. It did get passed in Pierce County. The hazard pay got passed through the city council of Pierce County, but the executive, Bruce Denmeyer, overrode it, vetoed it, basically.
Really?
The reason that he did that was, I think I have a quote here that he stated, fundamentally, the county should focus on reducing COVID-19 risk instead of driving up costs. If grocery stores are unsafe, make them safer, not more expensive. I think that statement is just ignorant of the profits that were being made by these companies, and either that or worse, it's his unwillingness to act in the best interest of our communities because he has an allegiance to these companies. So I think that's a clear example that we absolutely need to remove politicians such as that don't support the working class. And as far as the companies go, I wish I had a really great reason that they gave us for stopping hazard pay, but the truth is they just decided one day that things were getting better and there was no reason to continue with hazard pay. I'd have to go back and look at my own notes because we bargained with the employers several times during the pandemic in order to have hazard pay and other precautions put in place. But I'm pretty sure they stopped hazard pay before the vaccines were
they did,
before they were readily available to everyone. And I just don't understand what their reasoning was other than they didn't want to spend the money.
Yeah, Fred Meyer did a $100 bonus for employees who got the vaccine, which seems like kind of a poor substitute. I mean, I was like, sure, I'll take $100 for something I was going to do anyway. But
well, it wasn't the $100 to spend at the company store.
That one was actually cash. That was tacked onto the paycheck. They did a couple that were, you get a bonus just loaded on your employee rewards card, so you could only spend it at the store. That was a little... But I spent those ones all on gloves and masks, and I was like, you should be paying for this for me anyway. So
right.
The companies, what little narrative from them I heard in the press was that they were like, well, we operate on a razor-thin profit margin. Dude, you did $1 billion stock buyback, and the CEO got a $20 million bonus this year. Like, you couldn't. So that was interesting. I mean, do you think that this maybe in the longer term points for the need for organized labor to pursue tougher state-level policies about worker safety in case there's another public health crisis like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know later we're going to talk a little bit about the contract that we just ratified for the grocery members. But yeah, it was frustrating. I mean, the problem with bargaining like we were during the pandemic is that it's really what we call a demand to bargain situation. So it's between contract expiration, right? So it's not a normal situation where that you can allow the contract to expire and then take a strike vote. You're in between those, so you have no ability to strike. And you're doing a demand to bargain with the employer to talk about these different issues. And the truth is, they don't have to, all they have to really do under the law is meet with you. They don't have to agree to anything. And I went round and round with these guys about enforcing the mask mandates in their stores and this and that. And they just refused to do any of that. They would just do the bare minimum. And some of that, like what you just mentioned, the $100 to be vaccinated, that did come from the bargaining session.
Oh.
But overall, demand to bargain is not very strong. So we're much better off to push through legislature that will force these employers to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So going back to that economic overview, Marshall also discussed some interesting trends relating to plans for expanded e-commerce and automation by grocery chains. But those seem to, however, not be going as well as the companies would like. Can you talk a little bit about those and what they might mean for a union like ours?
Yeah, so there's no question purchasing groceries online became a big trend during the pandemic. Companies like Instacart profited from the trend, and I think the employers would like to capitalize on it. We've seen Kroger building these fulfillment centers throughout the United States. These are these big, giant warehouses that are automated. They have robots pulling product and this and that. They do not have one yet in the state of Washington, but it is in the plans. And then with Albertsons and Safeway, you have these backup store online centers. I'm not familiar if we have these in our area yet, but this was something that John Marshall discussed with us prior to the leadership conference. That was the first time I had heard of that.
It was news to me too.
Yeah, and it's unclear as to whether they can be successful or not. I think the problem at the warehouse level is the delivery system. Kroger hasn't figured out how to get perishable items into the hands of the consumers quick enough. When you order through Instacart, you have it like in 2 hours. But with the system they have with these distribution centers, it's almost like Amazon. That's, to me, the best comparison. And in a situation like that, when you're pulling product for delivery, you're probably expecting to deliver that product within a day or two. Well, consumers don't want that when we're talking about groceries. So that's why I don't think it's going to be profitable for them. I think they're going to have to figure out, a different means to make it profitable. It's something we're keeping a very close eye on. And if they do figure out how to make it sustainable and in a profitable strategy, then there could be organizing opportunities there, which we are excited about that aspect of it if it does work out. But for now, I don't really fear the future of our jobs in the grocery stores per se, because with the pandemic diminishing, customers are now returning to the stores to purchase items. I know we're not out of the pandemic yet, but it does seem like things are moving a little more back to baseline.
The Kroger plan was that those would actually be like Kroger employees, so those would be people that we could unionize. But like with Instacart, it's like those are all contractors. So
it would be very hard to organize Instacart. It'd be sort of like trying to organize Uber or DoorDash. It's not impossible, but they're not actually employees of the company.
Right. That's one of those American labor law things where you can classify people as independent contractors, and so they don't have the same rights as employees. Right. So for some further big picture context, the Economic Roundtable, which is a think tank, recently published a nationwide study on the state of Kroger's workforce called Hungry at the Table. The study was underwritten by several UFCW locals, and we'll also link to that in the show notes. Some of the major findings of that research were prevalence of part-time work among Kroger employees, wages losing ground relative to the cost of living. Pretty common, though, honestly, nowadays, unfortunately. 2/3 of surveyed workers saying they struggle to cover basic expenses. There is food insecurity among 3/4 of the workforce, according to USDA metrics. 14% of workers currently homeless or homeless in the past year. And 2/3 of workers reported increased workload without increased hours or pay. Worsening health and safety issues in the store, and widespread work and life issues caused by unpredictable scheduling. The list goes on. I have to say, having been a shop steward in a Kroger store, reading that study, I was like, oh man, this was like even worse than I thought it was. But in your time so far as president, how have you seen these sort of issues play out here in the South Sound among our members? And what did the results of our bargaining survey that we did for members show?
Well, I'm curious, before I answer that, Isaac, you working at the Tumwater store, do you know of any members that have been evicted or living in their cars?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, because I came to a contract action team meeting that you were at, and I won't mention the person's name, obviously, but I was sitting next to someone who I've known for a while now. And I was a little surprised when he had mentioned to me that he had just received an eviction notice and wasn't quite sure where he was going to relocate. So, I think this is really starting to hit home in the past 6 months or longer. I've noticed a lot of these patterns playing out. We've seen hours getting cut, especially as we're heading into contract talks. And then I've spoken with members of, who were a paycheck or two away of being evicted, like the person I just talked to, or those that are homeless and living in their cars if they're even lucky enough to have cars. So it's been a pretty tragic situation. I'm hoping this contract that we just negotiated will definitely make a difference in people's lives. I believe it will. One of the most concerning trends that I've seen is the rise in crime, both violent and property, in and around the stores. Prior to negotiations, we surveyed our members on their key areas of concern, and crime inside the stores now in the parking lots overshadowed concerns around COVID-19 in a big way. The top 3 issues that came out of the data that was collected from the surveys were wages and benefits, which I sort of lumped together, and then safety and scheduling. I really think that from being out in the contract action team meetings, I went to as many of those as I could. And I honestly was hearing more about safety from folks. There was one CAT team meeting I did in Tacoma where the entire meeting was about safety. Wages never even got discussed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, it's gotten really bad. We started a story campaign before we went into bargaining where we were doing video testimonies, and we ended up splicing together a number of these and coming up with this 20-minute video presentation that I played for the employers. They were not happy when I told them I had a video for them to watch. They really did not want to have to sit through that.
I bet they didn't.
But ultimately, we did end up getting our own safety committee, master safety committee, because I showed them how Pierce County is so much worse than King County. And Mason-Thurston County is not much better than it is better than Pierce County from a statistical standpoint as far as violent crime and property crime, but it still is rated pretty low. Yeah, these are things that we definitely have to keep working on.
Yeah, the safety stuff is wild, and I think maybe in imagination you would think, like, working at a grocery store isn't that dangerous of a job. But there have been these mass shootings that have happened at grocery stores. There was one in Eastern Washington not too long ago, and there was this one just the other day in Buffalo, New York. But there was a thing at my store. It was on a day I wasn't working, but it was an altercation between customers, where, as I heard it from several people, it was like a customer told another customer to put a mask on, and that guy pulled a gun, and the cops ended up getting called and tackling him. There was another one at Lacey not that long ago where some guy was like shoplifting and he took something out with him, and a customer tried to stop him in the parking lot by pulling a knife, and then the shoplifter pulled a flare gun, and then the customer pulled a real gun. It was like the Looney Tunes escalating like bigger weapons bit.
I mean, I'm laughing, but it's so very scary, right? I think part of my laugh is maybe nervous. It's just gotten out of hand. What happened in Buffalo is just devastating. That's also racially motivated.
Yeah.
And then the Colorado situation. And when Colorado happened, I immediately reached out to the employers and asked them, what are you doing to prepare our members and to make them more safe? And I literally got crickets from one of the employers. I forget between Kroger and Albertsons which is which on this story, but one of them I got crickets, and the other one sent me a one-page flyer that they said they give out to members when they hire them. That is really the run, hide, fight scenario, which is what we're taught to do in an active shooter type situation.
Yeah, there was a very not that helpful video about what to do in a shooting situation that we had to watch at my store, and that was it. As far as I know, there was no other safety measures taken as far as that goes. Moving on to the recent strikes by Local 555 in Portland and Local 7 in Denver, what were they demanding, and why did they end up going on strike? I have been told that these were actually unfair labor practice strikes, so maybe if you can talk just a little about the difference between ULP strikes and your classic economic strike.
Yeah, so a classic economic strike is when, as it says, you go out mainly for economic reasons. You actually have to still have some sort of language issue on the table, but that's sort of a legal thing. But you go out on strike, and they can be long-term. It's usually what will happen is that we'll strike one company, and then the other company will lock everybody out. So in this case, if we were to strike Kroger, Safeway, Albertsons would lock everybody out. That's generally what happens. And then you're out there for the long term. I was on the picket lines in California in the mid-2000s, and they were out on the picket lines for months. During an economic strike, they can replace you. You're not legally protected. There's no chance of regaining whatever money you lost while you were out on the picket line. Anyone that's been on picket line knows that the union doesn't pay much, and we don't provide benefits for being out on the line. So it really is a last resort. It's a powerful weapon, but it's not something we take lightly. But the trend lately over the last few years, I think it's a good trend, is what we call ULP strikes, unfair labor practice strikes. And what this entails is the union files some form of an unfair labor practice charge against the employer. It could be for failure to provide information. It could be bad faith bargaining. It could be changing of working conditions while you're in bargaining. It can be as simple as the company used to give you a turkey every November, and then you're in bargaining in November and they decide not to do that. That's an unfair labor practice charge. They have to still provide the turkeys. So what happened in Portland first, and I think to put this into context, there was a point where our local union almost went into a partnership collaboration with Local 555 in Oregon to bargain together. And to do that, we would have had to open our contract early. We did make an effort to open it early, and the employers did not necessarily agree to do that. But that was under our former president prior to his resigning and leaving the local. When I took over the local, I took a hard look at that coordination between the two locals and decided that it wasn't really a good fit for us. Their contracts are set up much differently. We have what are called multi-employer contracts. That means we're bargaining with allied employers, who's the representative for Kroger, Albertsons, and Safeway. Hagen actually is not in that group for some strange reason, even though they're owned by Albertsons. But there's other companies that are part of that multi-employer agreement. And in the case of 555 in Oregon, they have 99 different contracts for every Safeway store they represent. So it just didn't seem like a good fit. It turns out to be the best decision I made, because we ended up becoming part of a bigger coalition of unions that included the entire Western United States. Not every union, but some of the bigger unions. So we partnered up with Colorado Local 7, UFCW Local 7, and then we also partnered up with Local 3000 just north of us, Local 5 in Northern California, 324 and 770 in Southern California, and then, of course, us. and we had about 100,000 members between us. So when 555 went out first, this was back in December, I don't really know all the details around it because they tend to be secretive about what they're asking for and what they're doing down there. So speaking at all on behalf of 555 would just be conjecture.
That's fair.
But what I do know is that they were planning to strike for a few days and ultimately just did a one-day strike, and then they settled. And I've heard different rumors about what they got in the contract, but with the coalition, with these other locals that got together, we had met back in October of last year and had a long discussion about what did we want in these contracts. One of them was front-loading the wages. Money's worth more today than it is tomorrow, so it was important to us to get more in year one than in year 2 and 3. Safety was a huge issue for us. We wanted to do what we could to ensure our members were safer. And one of the key ideas that we came up with was to create an all-purpose clerk. And I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but just to give you some perspective on what we were all dealing with. So we wanted an all-purpose clerk, get rid of all these lower-tiered wage scales and put them into one higher scale. That was discussed between all the locals, and Local 7 just happened to go out on they were the first of the coalition to negotiate their contract, and they ended up filing a ULP. I think it had to do with information not being provided to the union. And then they took a 10-day strike. They were able to get the $2 in the first year and then 80 cents and 80 cents. So they front loaded their contract and also addressed a lot of the other issues, not all, but a lot of the issues that we had all talked about back in October. And I really think it paved the way for the rest of us as we went into bargaining.
So Local 367 here started its bargaining with allied employers, that's again representing Kroger and Safeway Albertsons, on April 13th, with a tentative contract being reached relatively quickly and the new contract having since been ratified. How does the new contract help to address some of these issues that we talked about or that were raised by the Hungry at the Table study? What are the major wins for grocery workers in this contract?
Well, this contract is historic in the fact that it provides the highest journey person wage increases we've ever seen, while also putting money into the lower steps of the wage scales, which is pretty rare. Usually it's the journey steps that get the increases, and then everybody else just works their way up to journey.
Journey, for context, is people who are at the top of a pay scale.
Correct, yeah. So the most significant gain in this contract came by taking a number of those subpar wage scales I mentioned earlier. This includes bakery, deli, fuel center, Starbucks, internet shopping, etc., and coming up with this all-purpose clerk designation. It's going to result in very large wage increases for those at the journey level in those classifications. Someone working in the fuel center is going to earn as much as $6.50 an hour immediately upon ratification. We also were able to address safety, grievance handling, scheduling, pension language, health and welfare. There's no takeaways in this contract whatsoever. And then we also came up with the workforce development. This was bargained in the last contract under something called We Train, but this is sort of a more developed idea around that. And it's to create a career path for people that want to be certified in certain positions, like a meat cutter or a cheesemonger or a floral designer. There's all these different paths that people could go down. And once you're certified, the union hall would almost work like a hiring hall, in that people could go through the We Train program and be certified, and then we can help them get promoted or get jobs in different stores. And it's still fairly new. We were able to bargain a penny per hour per employee to go into that fund, and we have 8,000 members. So that's a very good chunk of change, and that's also in conjunction with Local 3000 and Teamsters 38 up north. So we really are excited about this contract.
I am feeling pretty good about it myself. So what can you tell us about how the bargaining process played out for our local? I know a lot of us, myself included, were expecting a drawn-out and contentious process with the employers, but both ourselves and UFCW 3000 farther north reached apparently pretty good tentative agreements pretty quickly. I think you sort of hinted at like the willingness of Local 7 and 555 to go to the picket line might have influenced that, but also do you think the economic losses and PR damage that the strikes inflicted on the employers might have made them not want to test their luck here?
Yeah, definitely. After what happened in Colorado, especially, the employers came to us and pretty much made it clear that they wanted to try to get a deal done without going out on strike. And even if you just look at what the opening offers were here compared to Colorado or other places, it was much higher. I think they came to the table here with like dollars in the first year and 75 in year 2 and 3. They've never come to the table with anything that high before. So there's no question that Colorado sort of took the fight out of them, I think. But also, there's sort of this misperception out there that this was quick, and there was nothing quick about this. Back in July of last year is the first time that the International Union brought together all the locals from the Northwest and the Southwest of the United States to Orange County, California for a meeting of how can we all work together and support each other as we go into bargaining. That meeting did not go particularly well because you put a lot of presidents in a room and egos can sometimes flare up. But then there was a follow-up meeting that took place in Seattle, which was our coalition that I'd mentioned earlier. And that was a much different meeting. I went in there a little bit skeptical, but once I walked into the room and sat down with these presidents, I knew that it was true solidarity. They were there to find out, what can we do to help one another? How can we support each other? What do we want in the contracts? That's when front-loading the contract was first discussed, along with safety and some other issues. And really, we raised the bar because I think some of the locals that came to that meeting thought, oh, well, 75 cents each year, the contract should be sufficient. And that obviously wasn't, right? And I just think us having these discussions kind of raised the bar for everybody. And then the employers saw this. The employers saw the unions working together as a coalition. We all were doing the respect, protect, pay buttons and the strike pledge cards and doing all this work. But our local in particular was doing an amazing job on social media. We had people doing selfies of doing the pledge cards and wearing the buttons. And we even had a store in Puyallup that brought in Brody the goat.
Oh, yeah.
Our members had a goat and they all took selfies with the goat. The goat was wearing our t-shirt and it was a lot of fun. And I think the employers saw all of this happening and just, they didn't want any part of it.
In going around to both in my own store and other stores, gathering those pledge forms and stuff like that, I was, honestly, I have to admit, a little bit surprised by how many people were like, yeah, I'm ready to strike. Like, yeah. I didn't even get around to asking that yet. Like, I think people were fed up, and I think, yeah, maybe the employers sensed that in the air a little bit.
Yeah, people definitely were willing to strike, and I think when we struggle, we win, right? And I think people like to go through the process. So you have the contract itself, and then you have the process to get to that contract. And if people feel like they haven't gone all the way through that process, then it can, like I said, it can kind of cause people to look at the deal as maybe it didn't happen as quick, or maybe it happened too quickly, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll confess that as a filthy red, I was secretly kind of hoping that it would go to a strike, at least like a little short one, because that would have been a great opportunity to build class consciousness and organization and stuff. But like, that would have also been a big hardship on a lot of people, and being cognizant of that. But again, as you say, like, this gets us bigger increases than we've ever gotten before at one go. I was made aware of by another shop steward, there was apparently some criticism of UFCW 3000's, I think, as well as maybe ours, tentative agreement from folks associated with Socialist Alternative. And what were some of those, or like, how would you respond to them?
Yeah, I was surprised by Swan's actions, frankly, and SA, their opposition to Local 3000's vote. So just to be clear, they did not reach out to us at all or protest us in any way at Local 367. But they were definitely putting stuff out on social media. My understanding is that they showed up at some of the contract votes of 3000 to protest. And again, I think it goes back to what I just said earlier. I think one of their members had this misperception, well, this got settled too early, therefore it must not be a great contract, which isn't true. I do think some of what happened up there bled down into our membership, because we definitely had members that were sort of saying the same thing. We didn't have any protests, but there was a lot of conversation taking place on social media. There were people coming to vote no without even looking at what was in the contract.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I have to admit that I like Shama Sawant in a number of ways. I mean, if nothing else, she pisses off like the kinds of people that I don't like up in Seattle. You know, and she's been really good about supporting the Starbucks organizing that's been going on, and Socialist Alternative has been really good about that. But previous listeners of the show might remember Corey and I have taken a little bit of a dim view of the way they tend to relate to existing unions, in that they seem to leap to this conclusion that existing union leaderships are always opportunistic or sellouts or something. We sort of saw this at the last ESA national convention. And I definitely don't want to smear Trotskyists or Leninists with that as a whole group, because there's plenty of them who are amazing organizers who I've worked with and stuff like that. But there's this certain brand of Trotskyism that seems very obsessed with this idea. Like when UFCW 7's tentative agreement came out, I remember there was, I think it was like the World Socialist website, which is another small Trotskyist group, had this weird hit piece about that tentative agreement that, echoed that same viewpoint that, like it happened so quickly, so there must have been something shady about it, was the thrust of the argument. But
I remember seeing that piece, and again, I think it's that this whole process of us building this coalition of unions working together, I don't think it's ever been done before. So I do struggle with explaining to individuals that are upset or think the contract was settled too early, explaining to them how that whole thing came about. It makes sense that every contract would build on the next, right? We were at the end, so we were a little surprised when 3,000 settled, and when California settled, that meant we were the only local left in the coalition, which could be a bad thing, except that we reaped the benefits of everything that came before. So even though we were heavily involved in the process the whole time, I mean, there was grievance language that was bargained at 3,000 stable, but that language came directly from our local. I had met with, at the time it was Local 21, and I handed them the language that we were planning to propose and asked that they do the same. And there was a discussion back and forth, and ultimately they put that same language across. And then as the language got tweaked, because that's what happens in negotiations, I was in the loop the whole time on that. So ultimately we played a significant role in that language. Mm-hmm. But I think it's hard to explain that to people because they're just used to the old school way of our local goes to the table and puts these proposals across, and when we don't like something, we strike or we do a strike vote. This was a very unique situation. I hope that it's something that we can do in the future, because I think there were a lot of benefits by going down this path versus the traditional way of negotiations.
Yeah, something that I found kind of interesting about this was that it seemed like where our TA was concerned, more conservative people were sort of making the same criticism that the ultra-left, if I dare say, in the form of Socialist Alternative were making about 3000s, was that, like something shady must have gone on, or like, why didn't we get more money? I think maybe that was a case of the sort of idealist not accounting for the material conditions, where there wasn't a looking at what were all the real steps that led up to this, right? Like what we could win at the table was a result of the relative strength of the employers and the unions and what the other locals had been able to win and how fired up the rank and file was to get something. And so absent seeing all that in its full picture, you can get to this point where it's like, oh, well, there must have been malfeasance or they just lacked the will or something like that.
Yeah, and one thing, too, that's interesting is for over 30 years now, our locals' wages have been pretty much the same as Local 3000. So if we have members working in Grace Harbor, they make the same as a grocery worker in King County. Maybe not Seattle proper because of the minimum wage that they have in that area, but everywhere else in King County, like Berrien and White Center, the wages are the same. So there's also that criticism where people were saying, well, just because they settled, we should fight for more. The employers made it pretty clear that we could fight for more, but that they didn't think Grace Harbor should make what King County makes or Mason Thurston should make what Pierce County makes. So, those are the decisions that come into play towards the end. And all along, we were expecting to get the same as Seattle as far as the economics went. What we were really fighting for as a unique union had to do with safety, the grievance language, which I mentioned earlier, and I was able to get that done actually through 3000's table. But it was mostly safety that we were the most concerned about, because the crime rates in Pierce County, Mason Thurston, and in our jurisdiction are so much higher than local 3000s up north.
Mm-hmm. Even the best contract, of course, won't solve every problem in a workplace. You've talked about safety a lot. So what do you think is the role of shop floor rank and file activism in further resolving some of the concerns raised by members and discussed in the study, like the safety issues in the stores?
There's no way that we're going to get everything resolved as far as safety goes at the bargaining table. It's just too complex. To really address safety, and I'm talking about mainly about violent crime, more so than property crime. I mean, people can replace things, they can't replace people. So it's the violence that concerns me the most. In order for us to address that, we have to go to city councils, we have to partner with other unions, we have to talk directly to the police and to social workers and look at the mental health funding in our state, the homelessness situation. It's just a really complex set of issues, and there's no one-size-fits-all cure for any of this. And it may be that the answer is different for Mason Thurston than it is for Lewis County or one of the other counties. So I think that's where we're going to pick up where we left off. Heading into negotiations, we had launched this safety campaign, like I mentioned earlier, the testimonies and the videos and all that. I think we need to keep doing that, but also expand it. And it also goes back to what we talked about earlier about legislation. I just don't think we're going to get it done directly with the employers. We'll work with the employers and do everything we can with the safety committees and the vehicles that we have in place, but we're going to need to take it outside of the employer and force them to do the right thing when it comes to protecting the employees that work in these stores. And it's pretty controversial. Half of our members think we should have armed security guards at every store, and the other half are absolutely against that because they think the ones who will be harmed will be people of color or homeless individuals or those that are dealing with mental health issues. So I don't know what the answers are, but I think it all starts by mobilizing our members. One of the things that I want to do is put together a community political action team that consists of members who are both on the left, maybe center, and on the right to really sit down and talk about the issues. If safety is our number one issue, what are all of the components that make us feel unsafe right now? What are the situations and the issues that we need to address? And then work through this member-activated committee to reach out to the city councils and to politicians.
As someone on the left, this is an interesting and thorny issue because we would be foolish to blow off concerns about crime and safety as having just been made up by the far right. I mean, they definitely exploit them. But the unfortunate truth is that most of the victims of crime are working class people. But at the same time, most of the victims of police violence are also working class. And it's how you find solutions to these problems that really make things better. I as grim as all of this stuff has been, I think maybe there's an opportunity in here to help people understand the social roots of crime and insecurity and things like that, a stronger labor movement has a large role to play in improving the social conditions that would otherwise give rise to more of these things.
Yeah, definitely.
Going on in that direction, we talked earlier about the issue of housing insecurity and homelessness among workers. But in an encouraging development, our local has gotten involved on the political side of addressing the housing crisis by endorsing the Home in Tacoma for All platform. We'll link to that policy platform in the show notes. But it would be a lot of good progressive policy stuff to help keep housing affordable and good quality, try to put the brakes on this spiraling crisis that we're having. So in that larger context, what do you think the role of unions should be in promoting the welfare of workers outside the workplace in their larger community?
Well, we have a responsibility to do just that. I think it's critical that we support these kinds of agendas, such as Home for All in Tacoma, rather than reinvent the wheel. I definitely would rather become part or support a program that is already up and running or has good structure and is in line with the values that we have in the union and for what's in the best interest of our members. I think homelessness is something that affects all of us, right? It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It's affecting our communities. And this is one of those things I mentioned earlier about issues. It doesn't have to be divided politically by whatever party you associate with. If we just look at the issues that are affecting our communities and our members who work in those communities, then we should be able to partner on those things.
With the housing thing, I always think of one of those old Union cartoons from the 19th century, and it's the picture of the capitalist in the top hat squeezing a worker in a press, and the two sides of the press say low wages and high rent. And it's
right.
like, yeah, we have to tackle both sides of those things. Yeah, we could win a big wage increase at the bargaining table, but then if, everyone's rent gets doubled overnight, then the pay increase we won means nothing, basically. We have to tackle that policy side of stuff. On that subject, has there been any controversy that you've seen with the membership about us endorsing that? Because it was a pretty overtly left-wing coalition of groups, including Tacoma DSA, that were championing that. And if there was, how do you respond to it?
We have not received any criticism on this. Our membership is interesting. We're very much divided right down the middle. I say right down the middle. It could be a little leaning on either side, but we definitely have a Republican base and we have a left base. And I think we have a very large DSA segment within our membership as well. But one of the things I like the most about our members is when I'm out talking, even when we did the leadership conference back in January, I spoke with a number of right-wing thinkers, and these are activists in the union, and they were very pro-union and very happy to be part of the union. They didn't want to get into politics, but they were more than happy to talk about issues. We really have not received any criticism from any members that I'm aware of regarding Home in Tacoma for All.
I've mentioned this before. I mean, I studied political science, and I admit that I culturally live in the left-wing bubble or whatever, and you expect people's beliefs to be totally consistent, right? It's like if they believe one thing about X, then they'll logically believe this thing about Y, but it doesn't work like that in real life. People who are really conservative on some points will take weirdly left-wing positions on other things. I've seen this happen a few times, and I always kind of double take, but it's like, people understand their material interests too, right, at some level. And with the homelessness thing, I mean, I definitely encounter that sometimes among workers, is that there's this prejudice against homeless people, like they're just drug addicts or they won't get a job or whatever. But as we were discussing in that study data, it's like a lot of homeless people actually do have a job. A lot of them have a full-time job. That's one of those lack of solidarity things that does really bum me out, because it's like that's what happens to people when you don't have a union to protect your wages or protect your job against a wrongful firing, or there's not a working class movement that's there to make sure that rents can't be raised astronomically overnight. The solution to this is, in many ways, a stronger labor movement, working class public policies, and things like that.
It's really about education. We also hear from a lot of our members that don't feel safe in the stores. If you ask them about crime, they will point to the homeless situation a lot, which I think is incorrect, right? I don't think just because there may be some homeless in the parking lot or in and around the store that translates into crime, or that they're even any part of the crime. But so we have to educate not just on what a labor union can do for individuals, but also as a community, we need to take away the stigmatism around homelessness. Like you said, many of them do have jobs.
I know people who almost became homeless because landlord was just like, hey, guess what? We're turning this into condos. Everyone get out, and then you have to pay last month's and deposit on a new place. And, that happens to you a couple of times. It's like you don't have any money left.
Well, we have no policies in this area around them jacking up the rents. I had an apartment downtown Tacoma, down in the Stadium District. I remember I had two apartments in the same building. The first one was $400 a month, and then the second one, I think, was $850 a month and had a full view of the water and everything. And now I think that $850 apartment is over $2,000.
Yeah, the cost of housing, I know people who are trying to buy houses right now, and just the horror stories that they tell me about how much it costs now. Man.
Yeah.
But with the homelessness thing, I mean, yeah, dealing with it can be weird and uncomfortable, but those are also not the people who are going to shoot me at work.
Right,
Guns cost money anyway. Switching kind of more to talking about the general upsurge of labor that we've seen. Oh, the conditions of the pandemic combined with employer malfeasance that we've discussed have really helped fuel at least the beginnings of a revival of labor militancy in the U.S., although it's important not to overestimate this. That's sort of that's why I always love that Gramsci quote about pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Like, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves about where we're at while also taking heart in the victories we have and maintaining faith that our struggle can win. But how do you feel about the state of the labor movement in this country today? And how do the grocery strikes and our bargaining and stuff kind of fit in with this present moment of labor struggle?
I believe the labor movement is at a crossroads. I remember being on the road as an organizer in the late 90s, and there was this sense of optimism around forming a union in the workplace. People, they just weren't afraid back then, and the economy was soaring. Felt like a resurgence taking place, and I know just from my own experience that our movement was on an incline trajectory. Now what I'm seeing are these actions taken by workers all over the place, strikes, historic contracts, organizing of Amazon and Starbucks workers. It's exciting to see all of that happening, but it's a different environment. It feels like it's anything but optimistic right now. I would say things appear very pessimistic, having come out of the pandemic and seen the rise in crime. Inflation's now on the incline. Some experts are predicting that we're about to head into a recession. And then, of course, we have a war happening in Europe that's really affecting the entire global economy and supply chains. So I see anger and frustration as the driving force behind the recent strikes and the organizing campaigns, and it's really difficult to predict the viability and sustainability of what's happening. You know, I don't want to be a downer on your podcast or anything like that, but I'm feeling pretty pessimistic overall. But what I will say, though, is that I am optimistic about our labor movement and what people are willing to do. I'm especially optimistic about our local because I think we're doing some great work and we're doing it the right way. But it's just hard to see where everything is going to end up with the economy, with labor movements, whether we're going to see a sustained growth in organizing and first contracts being negotiated. And I really don't think, like I said earlier, you're not really organized till you have a first contract. That's where the real fight is.
Like I said earlier, I mean, I think we do have to be brutally honest with ourselves about what this really is that we're experiencing right now. It's encouraging in a lot of ways, but it's also still small. And the tactical and strategic question for both the labor movement and the socialist political movement is, how do we sustain that? How do we make it survive and get bigger and become more of a permanent upswing of the labor movement? That's, I think, the thing we need to be thinking about a lot right now, is how do we build this up and keep it going?
Right. What we need more than anything right now is solidarity. We need people coming together on issues and working together instead of attacking each other.
On the note of increased organizing activity, some local grocery store workers who have not previously been unionized have filed to become bargaining units in our union. That's specifically the home and apparel departments at Bread Meyer and Tumwater. So they're having their union election right now. So for context, how did we end up with some stores being partially union and partially non-union in this area?
Well, this goes way back. There's clarification of units. It depends on the contract. So if you're looking at a place like Sumner, Washington, where we have a Fred Meyer down there, we have very clear language that says if you sign people up to be union and sign a majority of them up on applications, then they're part of the union. We don't have that language in a place like in the Mason Thurston contract or in a place like Tumwater. So in that case, we have to physically go in and sign people up on union authorization cards. I wasn't around, so I can't really speak on specifically why the grocery side was organized and not the GM side, but I can tell you, and GM meaning non-food.
General merchandise, yeah.
Yeah, but what I can say is that because of having a background in organizing, I would guess that there wasn't interest over there for whatever reason at the time. So the union chose the path of least resistance, which is common, to go ahead and get the group that does want the union right now. And then there was a situation that happened once in the early 2000s, because we do have non-food general merchandise in Pierce County. We have a contract for them. And there was a contract that was being negotiated. And for whatever reason, they ended up getting rid of the union medical plan and moving on to the company plan. I'm sure they received money for doing that. But ultimately, though, I think it has hurt our ability to go organize these other groups because we couldn't promise them a better medical plan. But now with the resurgence that we're seeing happening all around us with organizing and strikes and all these other actions, there's just sort of some momentum that's happening that I think has really swept up even into our stores. They see what we're doing. They see what's happening out there. They saw us heading into negotiations with the social media campaign and the pledge cards and the strike buttons and all this other stuff, and they want to be part of that. So it's exciting. I'm excited to bring them into the fold.
From talking with folks in my store, there was definitely a lot of anger about being pulled to do work that they weren't supposed to do, having their schedules messed with without notice. And then there was also the fact that there's people in those departments who've been working there as long as I have, and they make like $4 an hour less. And I think from what I heard, it was kind of back when this all happened, the company was like, oh yeah, we'll just like pay you the same as the union departments. And, clearly that did not happen. And now they're having the same thing like Starbucks did, where they're making them sit through these meetings about why you don't really need a union and the company cares about you. And it's like, well, why didn't you pay us more this entire time? My favorite one, somebody took notes from one of those, and it was like, well, you needed a union back in the 1800s, but you don't anymore because there's federal laws that protect your rights. And it's like, well, where did those laws come from? Why are they still here? Was it unions?
Exactly. It was unions that created those laws, but the laws don't protect people the way we want them to.
Right. But how does having the stores be wall to wall, as you put it, that is like just every department, everyone being union, how does that better serve the material interests of workers and also strengthen the union and give it more leverage with employers?
Well, there's strength in solidarity. So the more members we have in any given location or a contract, it makes us stronger overall. What's really important, even though they may have a different contract, sometimes even a different expiration date, is that you can still do actions that support one another. We may not be able to strike if there's a contract in place, but there's leaflets and other actions that we can do to support one another. If you have a non-union segment inside a store, and then that store, the union side, is going into negotiations, they can definitely try to use that against us. They can try to float people over, what we call scabs, right? If we're on strike, we don't really want them crossing the picket line to perform the work. We'd rather have managers have to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just another way to keep them from playing us against each other. If you both are union and you both have contracts, then you can support one another, and it's harder for the company to drive a wedge in between you.
Absolutely. On the note of things like that, in terms of what employers can do against the unions, and this comes up again as we again see this moment of labor organizing. So American labor law is this interesting contradictory creature in that it protects workers' rights to organize and advocate in some respects, but also limits workers' ability to challenge the bosses or reshape the economy in others, right? It's like your concerted activity is protected, but also if one union goes on strike, another union can't go on strike to support them if they're not directly a party to the dispute. Is one of these typical features of American labor law. But what do you think are the aspects of American labor law that are most harmful or restrictive to unions organizing in our current moment? Or if you had a wish list of pro-labor legislation, what would be at the top of that list?
Well, Taft-Hartley was introduced in the aftermath of a major strike way back in 1945 and 1946. So I think that would probably be the biggest hindrance to us having power as a movement. What's so surprising about this legislation that was passed was that it was really put into place by a bipartisan effort. Republicans and Democrats together put this through, and it really limits our ability to do what are called wildcat strikes or solidarity strikes, boycotts, secondary boycotts. It took away closed shops, which closed shop is you have to join the union. Now, of course, there's ways not to do that. Well, we had the Janus Act, which covered public employees, but even before that, you have the BEC situation, so you can choose to be a BEC member and not have to pay dues or not pay the full amount of dues. Right to work came out of this. There were laws that came out around the same time, right to work banning union shops and giving everybody the freedom to choose whether or not to be in the union. That, of course, takes away our power. The employer knows how many people are in the union. So by having a right to work situation, and if 30% of the folks are in the union and the other half think, well, I don't need to be in the union because I get the same benefits. Well, you and I, Isaac, both know that's not true.
Right. We know that.
What you've done is weaken the union so that none of us get better benefits or pay or whatnot. So I think that's the biggest hindrance to the labor movement right now. So if I had a wish list that I could just put under the Christmas tree, I think it would really be
get rid of Taft-Hartley.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think how to phrase that. I think getting rid of our ability to not do sympathy strikes, whether it's Taft-Hartley, well, I guess it would have to do away with Taft-Hartley or somehow override that, but it would allow us the ability to do sympathy strikes. That would be a game changer. That would completely disrupt the entire system if we were able to do that. That alone would be huge, but I also think if we had like what they have in Europe where there's sector agreements in place that, but if they're voluntary, they pretty much cover an entire industry or a sector, and it's sort of a value system almost, or some sort of an agreement, written agreement that employers will conduct themselves in a certain way. And, and if they don't, of course, with the ability to do sympathy strikes, you can put a lot of pressure on those employers to get in line. Those two things would make a huge difference. And of course, any legislation that allows easier access and easier opportunities to unions to organize the non-organized, like the PRO Act and all that, would, of course, have to be on that list.
I'll put a link to this in the show notes, but there's a great article by Matt Brunig called When McDonald's Came to Denmark. And people love to quote the thing about, like, well, in Denmark, McDonald's workers make $22 an hour, but he then sets out to explain why that is. And apparently they don't even have a legal minimum wage or legally binding union contracts. It's just the labor movement is so strong that they can just punish employers who don't kind of do what they want. McDonald's came in and was like, yeah, we're not going to pay the prevailing wage and we're not going to let the union into our shops. And so construction workers refused to build their stores and printers refused to print cups. And it's like they literally could not run a business at all until they caved and were like, okay, fine, we'll let the union in and we'll pay prevailing wage. But in thinking about that, it's always important to remember it's a militant labor movement that drives good labor law and not the other way around. So I'm curious, do you see the working class agenda outpacing formal politics in this moment? Is politics keeping up with the labor movement right now?
Well, I really don't think it is. Before I answer that, though, I want to step back just for a second on what we were just talking about, because we do have a little taste of what happens when you have the ability to do sympathy strikes or actions. And we've seen it with the longshoremen. When the longshoremen shut down the docks, it affects everyone, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's their number one sort of weapon that they use. Now, in our situation, when I was on the picket lines down in California in the mid-2000s, or early 2000s, the Teamsters down there, of course, deliver the product to the stores, right? Mm-hmm. And they were not doing that. Or if they did deliver the product, they were parking the trucks down the street, and then scabs would have to go down there through the picket lines and unload the trucks. So it was quite the situation. So I just want to bring that up because the Denmark article, I did read that. That's a great example of what happened with them. Your listeners should definitely go back and read that article. But
it's a heartwarming piece.
Yeah. It really is. But as far as is politics keeping up with the labor movement, I don't think so at all. And again, I try not to be too pessimistic. I'm actually an optimist, but I don't have a lot of faith right now. But what I do have a lot of faith in are the generations that are coming in behind us. You know, I just think that the next generation is more inclusive and more in line with what the labor movement is all about, and probably what socialism is all about, which is working together and coming up with solutions. Right now, I just see our country as extremely divided, including our own membership, as I mentioned earlier. So I think we have a lot of work to do.
I'm reaching that advanced age of my mid-30s where I'm like, I don't get Gen Z's culture at all. But then, Starbucks goes on strike. Like earlier this morning, one of the Starbucks here in Olympia went on a ULP strike, and I'm out there and I'm like, yeah, no, the kids were all right. It's fine. But let's talk for a moment about the working class more generally. Previous listeners will know that Corey and I have our take on what constitutes the working class. But like so many concepts in American political discourse, everyone you ask has a different answer. But Michael, how would you define the working class?
Well, the way I define the working class is any group subjected to oppressive laws or policies that hinder them economically. That's pretty much my definition. I don't view the working class as a single group or type. I just see it as a potential coalition of different genders, races, and sometimes even ideologies. And again, I think the working class need to come together on issues that affect all of us: safety, homelessness, labor laws, etc. It's funny, I don't know about you, Isaac, but there seems to be this whole misperception out there around the working class. Like everyone sort of looks at white men as far right. It seems like if you're a Democrat, you must be anti-gun, which is not at all the case. I know a lot of liberals that own guns, or that blacks and Latinos are Democrat. We both know that that's not true.
Yeah, there are a lot of stereotypes out there. I often think of something that Eric Blanc said on social media, who is a DSA member and labor journalist, but he said, I do not see the political usefulness of defining the working class any more narrowly than everyone who has to sell their labor in order to survive. I was like, yeah, that's it, pretty much. But do you think, are there any particularly widespread or harmful misconceptions about the working class that have currency?
When Trump was elected, there was a misperception out there about the white union guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was no way that they were going to vote for someone like Donald Trump, but that's exactly what happened. And then I think this time around, there wasn't a lot of faith in the blue wall in the states like Michigan and Pennsylvania that they were going to swing the other way and elect Joe Biden, but yet they did, right? And so I just think the way I look at it is it's really about critical thinking. The one thing I've learned, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, is everything that I see, everything that I watch on TV, I question. And I also question, and this is probably the more important, but I question my response to the information, whatever my reaction is, because I know that I have my own biases and history and baggage that I carry around with me. And whenever, especially if I hear something and I'm offended, I immediately ask myself, why am I offended? And once I kind of start talking through that, I tend to relax and try to see from the other person's point of view. So I just think it's a big mistake for us to look at Latinos and assume that they must be Democrats when we know, in fact, that's not the case, right? It's just sort of what's being said out there. The same with blacks and the same with Democrats in general. So yeah, I just think we need to stop labeling everything and just take the time to listen to what people's issues are and focus on the issues.
It's funny, as a Marxist, I think people have this idea that theory is this big Einstein's chalkboard of weird equations, and it's like, no, follow the money, right? Who materially benefits from, a particular way of thinking or a way of arranging things. And I think that a lot of these perceptions about the working class fall into that. Where, yeah, you're right. I've heard this take that working class is literally just affinity or identification that reactionary old white men have. But sure, there are reactionary old white men in the working class. But one, I mean, we said it's everyone who has to sell their labor. Is like the working class is 90% of the people in the world. in all their diversity, and that's what makes the working class the agent capable of changing things. There's also this weird perception that there's not class conflicts within different groups. There's class differences within different races and things like that. But a lot of public discourse glosses over that, and to me it's always, who does it benefit to have you think that people are just monolithic and that there's not shared interests, right, across these differences that are used to divide us, right? You know, one of the things that I have loved seeing as a shop steward is, yes, here's people of all genders, ages, and races being pissed off at the boss about the same thing and working together to fix it. And it's like, yes, this is why we focus on the working class. Right? It's not to say that what people experience from racism isn't frequently worse and more intense than what they experience as being exploited as a worker. But it's like the fact that every worker shares a certain core of experiences is what enables us to build a majority that can actually change things, including the conditions that empower racism and things like that. So yeah,
we have a lot more in common than we do differences, especially when we're talking about the working class under the definition that you quoted earlier.
Even well-intentioned liberal or left-leaning people sometimes still subscribe to this worldview that there's still like more that divides us than unites us. Even if they're not negative about that, it's like, no, but we still actually do have more in common in a lot of ways than separates us. And if we don't think about that and don't build a shared program around that, we won't have the majority and the power that we need to change things, right? I love that at our leadership conference when what was his name? The historian guy who was telling us about the history of the labor movement.
Mark McDermott.
Yeah, and he had the quote from one of those old 20s robber barons about, he's like, yeah, we stir up racism among the workers because it keeps them weak so they can't fight us. And I was like, yeah, the villains can't help telling on themselves. You know, if you're a white worker, racism is actually bad for you too, because it keeps you from winning something more by standing in solidarity with other people. And like, that's part of, it's a terror and a misery to so many people, but it's also a grift. It's designed to grift you. I know the people who want to use racism to treat other people worse than me also really don't care about my best interests.
No.
So on that note, we're coming up to the end of the show here, so I think we should wrap this up with a call to action. So what can DSA members and other community supporters do to help strengthen the labor movement generally and frontline workers like the members of Local 367?
Well, I would say get involved. Get involved in your union, in your community. Stop and listen to the other side and try to understand where they were coming from or what they've been through. Try to focus on the issues that affect all of us rather than political ideologies. Be part of the solution, not the problem. We have to bring people together. The biggest problem that we're facing and the reason for the pessimism, in my opinion, is that there's just so much division and polarization going on. You know, the last 6 years has taken a really heavy toll on everyone, especially the working class. So I think it's time that we start the healing process. And this goes back earlier, Isaac, you and I talked before the show about the vaccine status mandate that Kroger was putting out to the employees.
Oh, yes.
And I had made a comment that, as I said earlier on the show, our membership is very divided. And I was getting a lot of complaints from members about what's the union doing about this and this and that. And I ended up posting something saying that we're against this kind of a mandate. They didn't bargain with the union over this. I kind of don't want the government telling me what to do. I want the government providing free medical and education and all the programs that make us a better society. But I don't want them telling me, you know, what to do with my body or this or that. And so I put that out there. And of course, I immediately took a lot of heat from the more left side, right? And you actually had you jumped in at one point and said something really great. And I don't know if you remember what that was.
Yeah, because what it was Kroger wanted to make employees, it wasn't to make them get vaccinated, it was to make them share their vaccination status, right? It was, right. If I remember. And obviously, I think you should get vaccinated. I got fully vaccinated.
Me too. I want to be clear. Your listeners should know that
right. Speaking personally,
definitely pro-vaccine, and I'm proud of the fact that I've been able to convince people to get the vaccine.
But it was interesting, the timing, because that also came down right before negotiations started. And I couldn't help but feel like, regardless of my personal feelings on the topic, I couldn't help but feel like they were doing that precisely to just create a division right ahead of the negotiation happening. And it would put the union in a tough spot where no matter what the leadership did, somebody would be pissed off, right? Because, I mean, more left-leaning people would be like, well, why didn't the union encourage compliance with this? But then if you encourage compliance with it, you know, you're going to piss the right-wing people off. And yeah, again, also as much as I'm personally pro-vaccine, I'm not necessarily thrilled about my boss getting to demand my medical information. That is actually kind of troubling. I don't think they would probably use it for anything good. And so I think my point in all that was, well, it was like the thing Corey and I quoted in the last episode, the thing where Lenin says, we can't build socialism with the human material we would like. We have to build it with the human material that we have been bequeathed. And I was like, yeah, we have to deal with people as they are right here and now and not as how we would like them to be. And sometimes that sucks, but it's also the only approach that's serious enough to be worth bothering with.
Right, and that is the phrase that you used in that response to one of the people that was being particularly brutal on me. And I just think that we have to listen to people. It's, my telling people you're wrong, you have to be vaccinated. I don't think I've ever convinced anyone to get the vaccine that way. But when I've asked them why they're opposed to getting the vaccine, what have they heard? And there's one person that said to me, well, there's not enough information out there. And I said, so the 300,000 pages of data that was used by the FDA, you've looked at that? And they just kind of laughed, right? And I said, serious, there is plenty of data out there. And I kind of talked the person through it. It was someone in my office.
Oh, yeah.
So for me, it's all about, we just need to have a little more grace for people and not just get stuck on our agenda or our argument and just try to find out why do they do what they do.
Yeah. Well, shared struggle is the thing that builds consciousness, right? When people struggle together to win a better deal from the boss, they start to realize how the system works, right?
Yeah.
On the vaccine thing, actually, I wanted to mention something. I don't know if you've ever seen this conservative people post this meme about, so why is the vaccine free when my insulin costs $800 a month or whatever? I've struggled with how to explain this in a way that isn't theory jargon heavy, but one, I can't be pissed that people are asking why their life-saving medication costs them so much money, but it's about what the state does in capitalism. The state does things that capitalism needs, but that aren't profitable. And it's like, if we're all in the hospital, we're not working or buying things, so we're not creating profit. But vaccines aren't profitable, so the state paid for it. The state paid to develop it, and the pharmaceutical companies took all the profit. But with insulin, it's like, oh, you have to buy that forever. So of course they're going to, rip you off for a bunch of money. Right. The pharmaceutical industry said right out, we're not in the business of curing diseases anymore because managing chronic conditions is much more profitable. So the answer to why the vaccine is free when your insulin is so expensive is actually the same thing. Right. It's the profit.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's like, but hey, the window to questioning why you have to pay out the nose to be alive is something that can maybe be spun in a positive direction. And like I said, you're sort of surprised sometimes by the beliefs that people have, right?
One of the other things that happened that's kind of in line with this is when we went into negotiations, most of the team were pretty new. I think only one person on the bargaining team had ever been in previous negotiations. So it was an eye-opening experience for all of them, but one in particular who may not have been completely a fan of the union. I mean, they're a longtime union member, but, I just think they were sort of on the outside looking in is probably the best way to put that. But I talked them into joining the team. I thought they would be a good asset for the team. And she completely turned around after being just sitting across the table from the employer and seeing how they behave and how they respond and the way they conduct themselves. And then seeing how hard it is on our end to have these discussions and to go back and forth. And it completely changed her. She was at the contract votes and talking to people and pulled me aside and thanked me for asking her to be on the team and how it was so eye-opening for her. And she wants to be more involved now and everything else. So for me, maybe it's because I started my career as an organizer, but I just think understanding the other side is the key. Asking questions and understanding where they're coming from.
And just finding shared interests.
Well, that's how you get there. By asking questions and getting to know them, you find out what those shared issues are, and that's where you find common ground. I don't know why DC hasn't been able to figure that out for the last 10 years.
I think it goes back to that who benefits. Keeping this culture war going that distracts from what shared material interests a lot of people actually do have in common keeps people doing that while business as usual goes on.
Right.
Because if people realized all the interests that they had in common, they would realize who their real enemies are, and that would be a challenge to the system in a way that finding reasons to hate each other doesn't accomplish.
It doesn't move the needle at all for any of us. It just keeps us on the hamster wheel.
I'm also personally, I find moralizing to be tiring. Right. Just as a personal level, but also it doesn't accomplish anything, right? I mean, I can scold you about how your beliefs are wrong, but that's not going to do anything. I mean, when you were scolded for your behavior as a kid, you never wanted to change it. You just doubled down, right? But when you can get people to see, and again, it's through that struggling for your own interest, you get people to see how the system is set up against them, then they can start to realize, again, it is actually solidarity is in their own interest. I mean, there's been research that shows that being in a good, strong, democratic labor union is correlated strongly with a reduction in racist attitudes. Oh, why do you think that is? Because you are forced to confront the fact that versus the boss, you and people who don't look like you or speak the same language as you still have the same interest.
Right.
And then that can sort of spread. I'm rambling now. So is there anything else you'd like to tell the audience before we wrap this one?
For any listeners that might be living in the Pierce County area, I don't know if you have listeners down there or not, but the Home in Tacoma for All is a very good project that people should put their time and effort into. Isaac, are you guys looking at that in your area?
I was hoping to get someone to come to one of our meetings to talk about it. It looks like we're sort of taking a break from our general business meetings for a month or two over the summer. So I might either have to organize a separate educational event for that, but it would be great to have our fellow board member, Michael Whalen, who promoted us endorsing that, have him come talk about the Home in Tacoma for All platform as something that either people down here in Olympia could get involved in or as something that we could try and replicate here in our area. It is a great set of policies. It's a great set of ways to move the needle on this issue, give working people some control back over their lives. Yeah, definitely encourage people to support that.
Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. I hope that there's more programs that we can support from DSA, and I hope you guys will be supportive of some of the ones that may come from different places.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much for joining us and for your time. It's been great talking with you.
You too. Thanks, Isaac.